Eskinder Nega warns of a hidden humanitarian catastrophe in the Amhara region of Ethiopia. The call to Eskinder was not easy to make. For days the connection was unreliable, the line broke and he was unreachable at times. But when Eskinder Nega finally came through, his voice had the same quality that has defined him for decades: calm, defiant, and determined. He did not begin by speaking about himself. Asked how he was doing after years of pressure, imprisonment, political persecution, and war, Eskinder gave a brief answer. He was well, he said, because the struggle was still standing. Then he redirected the praise elsewhere. The youth are the ones carrying the burden, he said, referring to the young fighters in Amhara, many in their late teens and early 20s, who he said are enduring the war with little more than conviction, faith, and bare necessities. They, he insisted, deserve admiration far more than those in leadership. The interview, originally planned for Amhara Genocide Awareness Month, focused on the humanitarian condition of ordinary Amhara civilians. But for Eskinder, the present war cannot be understood without tracing the ideological roots of anti-Amhara persecution. He argued that the violence facing Amharas is not simply state repression of political opponents, but a distinct campaign rooted in ethnic identity. What makes the Amhara case unique, he said, is that Amharas are being targeted not for what they believe, but for who they are. He drew a distinction between two kinds of violence in Ethiopia. The first is the familiar violence of an authoritarian state against citizens who demand rights, democracy, or accountability. That violence, he said, affects Ethiopians across ethnic lines. The second is different. Violence directed at Amharas as Amharas, with their identity itself treated as guilt. That distinction, he argued, is what makes the war genocidal. Eskinder blamed the Ethiopian state, and specifically the ethnic-based political order that has shaped the country for decades. He argued that the current government did not invent anti-Amhara ideology, but inherited, intensified, and weaponized it. He shared, "The violence is not random, local, or accidental. It is the product of a political system that has long cast Amharas as historical oppressors and other groups as their victims." He traced that narrative back to fascist Italy's occupation of Ethiopia in the 1930s. Before invading, he said, the fascist regime sought to weaken Ethiopia internally by portraying Amharas as colonizers and promising to liberate other groups from them. Leaflets and propaganda were spread in different languages, including in Oromo, Somali, and Tigrinya-speaking areas. The point, he argued, was to divide Ethiopia along ethnic lines and turn resentment into a political weapon. Eskinder argued that colonial seed did not disappear after the Italians were defeated. It was ignored. No serious national reckoning followed. Victims and collaborators were forced to live side by side without accountability or reconciliation. Then, he said, the same idea returned decades later through the student movement of the 1960s and 1970s. This time it was covered in revolutionary language. The old colonial narrative was repackaged as the question of nations and nationalities. What fascist Italy had framed as liberation from Amhara domination, later movements reframed as progressive politics. The words changed, but the core idea remained. That idea, Eskinder argued, eventually entered the state itself. Under ethnic federalism, he said, identity became the foundation of power, territory, rights, resentment, and punishment. In his view, the state became organized around a historical accusation against Amharas. That is why, he said, Amharas have been displaced, stigmatized, massacred, and politically targeted across different regions for decades. He acknowledged that other ethnic groups in Ethiopia have also suffered violence. But he insisted the Amhara case is distinct because the state itself has become a central actor. Non-state violence, he said, can produce atrocities and crimes against humanity, but when the state attacks, enables, or sponsors violence against a people on the basis of identity, the danger becomes far more severe. That is where, in his view, Amhara genocide stands today. He blamed the federal government, regional state structures, and what he described as extremist, ethno-nationalist elements within the ruling order. He pointed especially to the role of state actors in Oromia and Benishangul Gumuz, where Amharas have faced repeated attacks and ethnic cleansing. The point he returned to was not only that Amharas have been killed, but that the political imagination behind the violence treats them as a people who must be punished for history. That, he warned, is how genocide begins. The humanitarian crisis he described was severe. Eskinder said life in the Amhara countryside is almost impossible to capture in words. After years of living close to rural communities, he said he realized how little he had understood his own people. The poverty, he suggested, is not ordinary hardship. It is a level of deprivation that feels almost impossible to reconcile with a modern world. The war has compounded that suffering. Unlike wars with clear front lines, Eskinder said the war in the Amhara region is decentralized, spread across towns, villages, roads, farms, and mountains. There is no single battlefield. That means civilians are constantly exposed. Ordinary families live between armed forces, government suspicion, disrupted markets, interrupted farming, collapsed services, and constant uncertainty. He accused the government of punishing civilians under the claim that they support Fano fighters. Villages, he said, are treated as enemy territory. Civilians are suspected, intimidated, and attacked as a way of forcing the population into submission. This, he said, is collective punishment. He also pointed to massacres, mass executions, drone strikes, arbitrary detentions, and attacks on villages accused of supporting Fano fighters, arguing that much of the suffering remains unseen because of limited international access and the near absence of foreign media in the region. He spoke in particular about hunger. Before the war, he said, parts of the Amhara region already faced food insecurity, but there had been systems to monitor shortages and intervene before food insecurity became starvation. Those systems, he said, have collapsed. The result, he warned, is hidden hunger. It is hidden because the international press is largely absent. Hidden because aid agencies do not have meaningful access. Hidden because the government no longer controls much of the countryside, yet still receives assistance in the name of the region. Hidden because the suffering is happening in rural homes, not in front of cameras. He said millions are affected. Children are going hungry. Families that once depended on food support are being cut off. Supplementary feeding programs for children, pregnant women, and vulnerable households have been disrupted. The consequences, he said, will not end when the war ends. Malnutrition today will shape physical and cognitive development for years, even decades. The health crisis is just as grim. Eskinder described a health system that was already weak before the war and has now been pushed toward collapse. Clinics and health posts are unable to function normally. Rural families cannot access care. Children, mothers, the elderly, and the sick are left exposed. Education, too, has been devastated. He argued that the Amhara education system had suffered for decades under a political order that neglected the region and treated Amharas as people to be contained rather than empowered. Now the war has deepened that damage. Schools have closed, students have lost years of learning, and an entire generation is being deprived of education. For Eskinder, this is not just collateral damage. It is the destruction of a people's future. He also accused the government of weaponizing aid. The issue, he said, is not simply that aid is insufficient. It is that aid sent in the name of Amhara does not reliably reach the people most in need. If the government does not control much of the countryside, he asked, where is the aid going? His argument was not that assistance should stop, but that it must be delivered through mechanisms capable of reaching civilians directly. He called on the international community to investigate, monitor, and act. Human rights organizations, the United Nations, international media, and humanitarian institutions, he said, cannot claim ignorance forever. He also said Fano would allow independent investigators into areas under its influence, and would accept accountability if violations were found. We are willing to be held accountable, he said, in substance. The government should be held accountable too. But his strongest criticism was reserved for the silence. The Amhara region, he said, has become almost invisible. No sustained international press presence, no serious monitoring, no urgent humanitarian response equal to the scale of the crisis. No global outrage matching the suffering of civilians. That invisibility, he suggested, is itself part of the catastrophe. For the diaspora, his message was to persist. He cautioned against despair, and against antagonizing the international community. The task, he said, is to convince, organize, document, and keep pressing, until the genocide can no longer be ignored. This is a challenge, he said. But it is doable. By the end of the conversation, the wind could be heard through the line. Birds were audible in the background. Eskinder mentioned the mountains before him, beautiful and unreachable to those listening from afar. It was a brief human moment in an otherwise heavy conversation. His final message was about the future. The struggle, he said, is not only about accounting for the dead or surviving the present. It is about preventing something worse. It is about stopping an ideology before it reaches its final form. Genocide begins in the thought process, he said. That is where it must be fought.